Hi guys, welcome back to On Track GP. We're going to give you a quali recap for the last race of the year in Abu Dhabi. I'm joined by a very special guest, and I must admit it's going to be a bit confusing because we both have very similar names. You're going to have to get past that. So joining me, obviously, Sam, is another Sam Coop, which is like my name but a little bit shorter. So we've had this problem before. How are you doing, Sam?
Yeah, I'm really good, thank you, Sam.
Cheers.
Having a good week.
Good, Sam.
It's been a good season finale so far. So how are you?
Yeah, really good. Yeah, all good. Like you said, slightly better race than a few weeks ago. So yeah, it's exciting. So yeah, how did you find quali overall?
I I think that Abu Dhabi is increasingly kind of settling into being the season finale. I wouldn't say it should be yet, but I think quali showed that it is increasingly post 2021 and the track changes for that year. It's made it much more interesting, and I think that was a microcosm that we saw today. Yeah, Verstappen obviously being Verstappen, but behind him, there's no order, no way of working out. So yeah, very unpredictable.
Yeah, you're right. Like it's an entirely mixed up order, isn't it? I think McLaren early on weren't looking anywhere really, and they're certainly there in the top four at least. Yeah, it's like you said, it's sort of an exciting grid beyond Verstappen, which is obviously something we've said a lot of the time this year. So if we go back to Q1, obviously, like there was a big name out, and Sainz heading out in Q1. It's not been a great weekend for him, has it? Obviously, he had his accident in FP2, and now he's had this incident in Q1. What did you make of Sainz going out that early?
I wasn't as hugely surprised as you would usually be with a Ferrari going out in Q1. Yeah, I mean, it all kind of harks back to Vegas, really. It's been a very disorganized, difficult, week or so for Ferrari, and particularly Carlos Sainz and his side of the garage. That obviously compounded by the issues that he had in FP2. It's just he wasn't able to get any quality simulation in, wasn't able to get into the flow of the car at full tilt. FP3, he was what, 19th, 20th. So he didn't actually do any kind of representative running. So if a big name was going to drop in Q1, I did expect it to be Sainz, but I still didn't expect it to happen. So yeah, it makes the fight for P2 in the Constructors' Championship that little bit more interesting as well, seeing how well he might be able to fight through the field.
Yeah, you're right, and I think that's a good thing to highlight. Is even though both titles are been sewn up for a while, there is still quite a lot to play for. Obviously, you mentioned P2 there in the constructors. We've also got this four-way battle for P4, which perhaps me saying that shows how quite uncompetitive this season's been. That we're getting excited about P4, but yeah, there are a few places to play for in this last race. And if people don't know, obviously you get a huge amount of money depending on where you finish in the constructors. Less so in the drivers, that's more to do with their individual contracts. But each team will want to finish as high as possible. So, like you said, Ferrari and Mercedes are definitely going to try and go for that P2. Just off piece a little bit. What have you made of Sainz's seasons overall? Because obviously he's the only Red Bull driver not to won a race, but then he's had races like this or weekends like this, I should say, where he's been very up and down. Like how would you rank Sainz this year, sort of in relation to his whole career?
It's very difficult to kind of charter, I think, his year, because he has been consistent, but it is punctuated by these moments of kind of a really poor weekend like he's had so far, and then also Singapore, you can't take that away from him. That's something that Charles on the other side of the Ferrari garage hasn't been able to do this year. So it's a very mixed reading. I think it does reinforce the overall kind of feeling of Sainz and his career so far, of very steady and actually quietly better than I think people often give him credit for. If he does end up ahead of Charles, I don't know the points difference off the top of my head, but if Charles can't overtake him in the Drivers' Championship, that'll be 2 out of 3 years that he's beaten Charles. And yes, Charles has had his bad luck, but you still need to get the points on the board. And Carlos has done that. And he's come a long way from, I think it was the start of last year, where we were really looking at him going, he's making too many mistakes here. He's got a big new contract. Have they put the faith in him? But even again, he's having to get under pressure because Albon is now being linked to Ferrari for 2025. So he's always been kind of the bridesmaid almost, which I think is often unfair.
Yeah, fair point. Yeah, I think, like you said, like his season's very much sums up Ferrari overall, doesn't it? Like sometimes good, sometimes, as the other word, the Gattuso said in that famous press conference. So if we get back to quality, obviously he wasn't the only name out, obviously, but also I wanted to focus on Logan Sargent because he did set a really good lap, but he had 2 laps deleted for track limits in turn 1, which seems like an odd place. I was speaking during it. It's like when you have a driving test and you fail within the first 5 minutes, and yet you still got to do the whole driving test, even though you know you failed. Like he must have known he was out in the turn 1. Like, and as a result, he was the only driver who didn't set a time. He's going to start to, and barring any penalties, he's going to start at the back of the grid tomorrow. It's now 0. Like Logan Sargent hasn't beaten Alex Albon once this year, and I think that hasn't happened for a long time. So, what have you made of Sargent in this particular qualifier session? I know it's hard to judge because obviously he only had a few laps, but should he be making those kind of errors, especially that early on in the lap?
I think it goes with the whole narrative of when you're trying too hard, when you feel like your career and your race seat is on the line, you are going to take more risks and you're going to be slightly further out of bounds, and quite literally in this case.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, again, all season, his 1 lap pace hasn't necessarily been the issue. Track limits, however, has been. We've seen this a few times, as far back as Saudi Arabia, where he had a really strong qualifying session by all accounts, but again had lap times taken away from him, ended up going out in Q1. However, you do have to concede that surely 1 lap pace and track limits are inherently intertwined. He's the 1 lap pace is there potentially because he is going out of track limits. So he needs to kind of drive, I guess, further within himself a little bit. But yeah, I think it's a psychological thing, really.
Yeah, obviously, like you said, being a rookie as well. But of course, he wasn't the only driver to get track limits. We had Joe had 1 deleted, and I think Hulkenberg over the course of the whole qualifying had 2 deleted. So like there are a few points where drivers getting caught out. I don't think it was turn 1. I think it was turn 16 for both those drivers I mentioned. If we just go down to the whole of the Q1, so obviously Sainz out as we mentioned, Sargent out as we mentioned, and then both Alphas, which is not a huge surprise. They've been a team that's largely been quite poor. I mean, it's been quite random where they're going to be good at. And I think if you ask them, even they wouldn't have a good idea what tracks they've been good at. We've had sometimes where Bottas has been in Q3, other times when both drivers have gone out. And Magnussen joining them out. And then obviously we moved to Q2 and another big name's gone out. Hamilton just squeezing out. P11 he finished. Ironically knocked out by his own teammate. But even though that isn't quite true, I think it's probably quite a good reflection that Russell just seems to be having a much better weekend with the car. Something about it is really suiting him. And I think if you watched a few of Hamilton's onboards, he's really struggling with balance. Like keeping that car in the lines has definitely been a challenge for him. So what did you make of Hamilton going out when he did?
He's really not been happy with the 1 lap pace over the last couple of weekends. It's just not coming to him in the same way. Whereas George has looked pretty renewed, for a driver who hasn't quite hit the heights this year that I think we thought we would see from him. Building from a fairly strong first year of Mercedes. So on the one hand, it's lovely to see George performing well on a Saturday as we've become accustomed to, but also it's quite puzzling for Lewis and his pace, because he's still going to have a strong race pace, I'm sure. This is Lewis Hamilton after all. But it's just there's no real kind of rhyme or reason to it. And as for Hamilton being the other big name to go out early in qualifying, it seems like that's been a bit of a trend this year. Almost every race, I feel like we've lost a Ferrari or a Mercedes or a Sergio Perez from qualifying early. So it I think really highlights how much closer that midfield or behind Red Bull the pack has got.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think we mentioned it with Ferrari that Sainz session sort of sums up. I think this sort of sums up Mercedes session. Like I know Hamilton's going to finish ahead of Russell in the points, but in qualifying they've drawn, I think it's 11 each, like in terms of the head-to-head. And I think they both have tracks where they've done well, and like they both had tracks that are really poorly. Like I said, like it wasn't a huge surprise that Hamilton went out at Q2. It wasn't like big headline news. I mean, yes, he just missed out, but it's something that's happened quite a few times this season. If we're thinking to the race, do you think they've got enough to sort of move further up the points? Like, what would you expect would be the maximum that Hamilton can do, but also maybe touching on Russell a little bit?
Oh, that's a tough question, because so much, as we saw last weekend, so much depends on safety cars and other extenuating circumstances throughout the race. I expect he'll be able to work his way through. Like you look at some of the cars directly ahead of him, you've got an Alpine, you've got a Haas. You've got to assume that Tsunoda's going to fall back slightly, although he's going to have the bit between his teeth. in that fight with Williams in the Constructors' Championship. So I think he'll make progress. I think Sainz will make quicker and more obvious progress, obviously being that much further back. But really, in that battle, it does come down to the teammates at the front. I think will dictate who gets second in the championship.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned Tsunoda there. I want to move on to his teammate a little bit. P15 for Daniel Ricciardo. Not a great result. I mean, obviously, we're going to talk about Tsunoda a little bit in Q3. Like, Tsunoda's shown this pace in this car, and Ricciardo's just not been able to replicate that for whatever reason. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, he just, I don't know, it hasn't clicked. It hasn't come together. Not to the same extent, but at McLaren, when things did click, they really did click for Ricciardo, and he had strong weekends. But he did struggle to kind of get the most out of the car on a consistent basis. And that was the issue here this weekend, where Tsunoda has had a really consistent year. And as that car has improved, as they've developed it, Tsunoda has with it, I feel. So, yeah, I think Ricciardo is going to be a little bit mystified as to kind of the delta and pace there. But I don't think you can take anything away from Tsunoda.
Just run through the rest of Q2. So obviously Hamilton P11, Ocon P12, P13 for Stroll. Obviously not a great result compared to where Alonso finished. P14 for Albon, and then Ricciardo. So let's move into Q3 now. The important stuff. The last Q3 session of the year, and it's the same result we've had a lot of the times this year. 12th season pole. Sorry, not career. He's got plenty more of those for Verstappen, which equals the best. I believe the best Hamilton ever did in the season. I think 2016 Hamilton got 12. I think Verstappen's now equaled that. It's just another, not a record, because I think Vettel tops that, but yes, another stat to go along with it. But I'd say it's the same result, but it wasn't entirely sure. It wasn't looking like it was going to be certain to do that, was it? Like, we had this time where McLaren really looked like they were going to have, going to challenge at least, and maybe Norris gets on top, maybe Piastri. And ultimately, in the end, it was a mistake from Norris in sector 3 that's cost him.
Yeah, and it's weird because we've seen this a few times in qualifying recently for Lando Norris, where he's just kind of, I don't know, I don't think it's the pressure necessarily, but I think he's just maybe stepped slightly over the line. And yeah, we saw that through the hotel section, car really stepping out, and that ruined his lap. It gave Piastri the opportunity to out-qualify him. I really did feel that he could challenge Max to pole. Max, obviously in free practice, wasn't happy with the setup, was struggling. We saw him making changes right up until the end of FP3. And then even then, Max Verstappen, you can't take anything away from him ever. It is Max Verstappen after all. But he's looked strong, but he hasn't looked quite as dominant or quite as comfortable throughout those sessions. It wasn't quite the Max Verstappen that we were used to. So I do feel like it was there for the taking. But yeah, I think it's one of those things where just pushed it a little bit too far, and he's paid the price for it.
And I mean, obviously, is this a sign for next season? Like, obviously, people are going to see these results, think finally Red Bull being caught up. But again, is it a case? I think Horner said either yesterday or the day before that the biggest thing to change on the Red Bull car has been the livery. And if anyone knows the Red Bull livery, it barely changes, even with their special edition. So have they put all their focus onto next year? And this car is basically like the same car we saw in Spa whenever the last upgrade was? Or do you think this is actually a sign that some teams are starting to catch up and maybe we'll have a bit more of a competitive year next year?
I think both things can be true almost. Yes, the teams have started to catch up, but I think there's a lot of change in that Red Bull underneath the surface. I think very quickly they worked out the aero, worked out what works and how the bodywork should look and feel. And there's always going to be developments underneath. I expect to see them making a jump. Whether or not it will be as big a jump as the other teams around them will, is fairly customary throughout a regulation cycle for the gap to diminish somewhat. But they still are comfortably the best team throughout the ebbs and flows of a season. The other teams are stronger. The other teams are stronger, but not on a consistent basis. That kind of 2, 3 to 5 changes quite often, whereas Red Bull are always there or thereabouts.
Yeah, sorry, so rudely interrupts you. I wanted to bring in, obviously, we're the best team. I agree with you. I think the best driver, but again, it's another poor result from Perez. Yes, he had the track limits and he got his lap deleted, but a P9. I'm starting to feel like we're getting this situation with Perez where no one's really expecting anything from it. If he gets into Q3, that's sort of seen as a good job. But when was the last time he started on the front row? I mean, it might be really recent. I'm just forgetting it. But in my mind, it's been a long time since he's fought for pole. When we're talking about who's going to challenge Verstappen, is it going to be Norris? Is it going to be one of the Mercedes? Is it going to be Ferrari? Like, we've really stopped talking about, is Perez going to challenge Verstappen for pole? And there's something about his form's just completely slipped away. And now we're saying that getting to Q3, which should be the absolute bare minimum, but it's just the fact that Perez himself has set such low standards after that horrendous run during the middle of the season. Now we're sort of accepting that a P9 is good enough for a Red Bull. And like you said, this is the quickest car. It's been the quickest car all year. Like, shouldn't really be asked of Perez than a P9 starting spot.
It's an interesting one, and I think David Croft was saying on the Sky F1 comms that I think it's in the last 16 races, Perez has qualified P4 or higher once, which is a mind-blowing stat if you think about it. He just isn't able to hook it up over one lap. Red Bull should be expecting more. And I think it says a lot about how they've handled the situation publicly. I can't imagine that they are being all sunshine and rainbows behind the scenes. But publicly, they've been, on balance, pretty supportive of him. He needs to up his game. Whether or not he's in the seat next year or not, obviously, that's been a big talking point. But I cannot see him being in the seat past 2024. It wouldn't make sense.
Yeah, I agree with you, Nat. And I think I'd be very interested to know, like, saying, I mean, you don't want to bring it up, but 2 years ago, say for that situation where it's so tight between the top two teams, top two drivers, would Red Bull be this relaxed if, like, Max hadn't sewn up the title on his own, kind of thing? Like, you start to think that if there's a bit more pressure, that's going to really reflect on the whole team and not just Perez. So yeah, like, it's a one to keep an eye on for. I sort of agree with you that I don't think he gets his contract extended. In the back of my mind, I wouldn't be surprised if we had like an in-season swap, or maybe Ricciardo moves up or whatever. But yeah, I can see definitely someone to watch out for. Yeah, if we complete out the top two rows at least, like, yeah, Leclerc obviously next to Verstappen, which was sort of a lap that came from nowhere really. Like, I think he finished P9 in the first runs of Q3, and then suddenly shot up the board. I mean, that probably shows that what Leclerc can do and what Ferrari can do on their day, which is not always the case.
Yeah, absolutely. I was not anticipating that at all. I kind of thought, you know what, it clearly just isn't there for them this weekend, and he'll be mid-pack out of the top 10. But Charles Leclerc, he can pull it out of the bag as good as anyone can over one lap, and he's shown that is a really, really strong performance from him. And he just on a Saturday, that Ferrari at the hands of Charles Leclerc comes alive, and mega job. And I look forward to seeing what he can do in the race, with Russell obviously only just behind.
Yeah, you're right. Russell P4 and then Piastri P3, another good quality session for him. Probably he's been helped, but finally this is a track he's used to. I mean, he had pretty much all year Piastri having to learn new tracks, but now at least he's back to one he's familiar with. Just running down the order, Lando, as I said, P5 after that mistaken sector 3. Yuki Tsunoda, great qualified session for him, up into P6. Alonso P7. Hulkenberg, another guy who's had a good session, into P8. Sergio Perez and Pierre Gasly rounding out the top 10. Usually at the end of this, we like to do top 3. I usually get asked and I make horrendous predictions. I'm pretty sure I said Albon for a podium last race, not last year. I'm going to ask you for your top 3. I mean, there's not a high bar set. Do not worry about getting any of these wrong, because mine are usually pretty awful predictions. So who are you going to go for your top 3? And maybe just give us a summary of what you think might happen in the race tomorrow.
Okay, so top 3, Verstappen. No shocks there. Second, I'm going Norris. Third, I'm going Russell. Summary of the race, Verstappen will run away with it. But as ever this season, it's what happens behind that's the real talking point. It's really of interest. I think Norris will have a strong first lap. He'll work his way through. Piastri will have a solid race, but he will ultimately fall back slightly. Leclerc, again, the race pace, I can't see it being there in the same way. I think that he will fall behind the Mercedes, and I think that will be key in the fight for P2. So I think that will be the kind of the keynotes. But expect to see Hamilton and Sainz work their way through. And As for AlphaTauri, I think they're just going to miss out. I think they're going to score good points, maybe 7th or 8th, but I don't think it'll be enough to take the position from Williams.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm largely agree with you. I think I'm going to be bold. I always like to be a bit bold and go for a double McLaren podium. So I'm going to think.
Nice.
I do think Piastri's got the pace to hold off Norris, but can he do that over the course of a whole race? I mean, it's going to be hard. So obviously, Max is the obvious P1 candidate. I mean, it's going to take a lot for him not to win. I'm going to go Piastri, and then I'll go Norris as my P3, and that will be hopefully be an exciting race. Like you mentioned, there's a lot of people out of place, or there's a lot of mixed up order. So yeah, it should be an exciting one. And of course, you can catch all the exciting race on our live watch along. 12:30, we're kicking off. 1 p.m. race start. Want to see you there. Sam, thanks again for joining me. Where can all the people find you? What's your Twitter? What website? All that good stuff.
So I am the editor-in-chief of Formula Nerds. So www.formulanerds.com. At Formula_Nerds on most social medias. So X, formerly known as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. So yeah, that's where you can find us. You can also find me there as well, at Samuel T. Coop. If that's what you're also asking there, Sam.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, don't get us too mixed up. We have very differing opinions. That sounded awful. We have good opinions about different races. But yeah, thanks again for joining us, Sam. Do the usual. Make sure you like the video, subscribe so you never miss a release here. Yeah, tune in tomorrow. Final race of the season, 2023 season, almost over. One more to go, and that's it. Thanks for watching.